Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm pleased to welcome you back for the 10th and final installment of our Voter Education Project series. Of course, the national security issues we've covered will remain vitally important no matter who wins next Tuesday. You can access the entire webinar series and all of our previous webinars on our website, securefreedom.org. Today's program is entitled Post-Election Insurrection: The Civil Unrest in the Coming Months, featuring our special guest, Michael Anton, as well as my colleagues, Michael Waller and Kyle Scheidler, who will be moderating. Please note that you're in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded, will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, as well as our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll turn it over to our Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Kyle Scheidler.
Thank you, Adam. As Adam said, this is our 10th and final voter education seminar. We've covered a lot of ground since we began this series in September, discussing the threat from China, threats to the integrity of the elections, economic warfare, military readiness, as well as a global surge in anti-Semitism. But the focus of these webinars has been on what we see as a growing threat from anarchist groups like BLM and Antifa, which represent a very serious and growing threat to the Republic, no matter who wins the presidential election. Joining me today to discuss the potential for continued unrest post-election is a man that I'm very proud to call my friend, Michael Anton, former Trump national security official, Claremont Institute senior fellow, and lecturer at Hillsdale College. He's an author of an incredible new book, The Stakes: America at the Point of No Return. And I've read it several times, and it's really great. It's not a book just about the election. It really covers a lot of territory about how it is that we've reached this unenviable position where every election feels like a regime crisis that will determine the future of the country. And he looks at some possible trends if things don't change for the better. So it's a really great book, and I would encourage you to go get it. But that's not the reason we wanted to talk to him today. I wanted to talk to him in particular because of a very important essay he wrote. You may have heard about it talked about on the Dan Bongino show or the Rush Limbaugh show, but it was called The Coming Coup? If you haven't read it, I encourage you to do that. But we're going to get into the details of that essay with him, what he thinks portends for the post-election situation. Michael Anton, thank you very much for taking time to talk to me today.
Thank you.
Also joining me today to help shape our understanding is another good friend, Dr. J. Michael Waller. He's a senior analyst for strategy here at the Center for Security Policy and an expert on all things subversion, psychological, and information warfare. I'm also pleased to say he's a contributor to a new center monograph entitled Unmasking Antifa: 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat, which should be available within the next several days, and which I'm really excited about you guys having a chance to take a look at. Michael, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
So we'll start off and we'll jump right in, Michael Anton, with the Coming Coup ? So this was an essay you wrote about, and it had to do with this organization called the Transition Integrity Project and a war game that they put on, where they envisioned a scenario where President Trump appeared to have won on election night, and the steps that they then proposed to take to respond to that. Talk to me about what you saw in that war game and why it concerns you so much.
Well, it goes back actually prior to the war game. The war game is what I think finally cemented in my head that they were up to something. Biden started talking openly about having the military drag the president from the White House. I don't know how long ago, but in the spring. I found it also extraordinary when the Secretary of Defense, during the beginning of the woke riots, the Floyd riots, the 1619 riots, we can give them many names, decided to go on the record to say to the world he opposed the invocation of the Insurrection Act. Now, it's totally fine for a cabinet secretary to oppose president's actions, but the traditional way you do it is you say it in private in a meeting, but you follow whatever order is given unless it so violates your conscience or your sense of propriety or whatever, in which case you resign. what I found extraordinary was he and a bunch of generals went out there and went on the record in public as a rebuke to the president, a sort of formal, a priori rebuke, saying, don't do this, don't give us this order, or we won't follow it. That's, you start connecting these dots, it looks ominous. Then there was don't forget maybe the most famous remark of all, which was Hillary Clinton saying Joe Biden should not concede under any circumstances. Capstone to this was the leaked report, deliberately leaked by them, the Transition Integrity Project, perfectly Orwellian name, which should be called the Ensure Biden Becomes President by Any Means Necessary Project. I don't know what acronym that creates, but we can tweak the language to get something good. And they deliberately, it's all Biden partisans, Democratic partisans, never Trumpers, former Republicans, and so on. A lot of the greatest hits of our former friends and colleagues in the former conservative movement were there to help ensure that Joe Biden got installed at gunpoint no matter what happens. And they specifically leaked a scenario in which Trump clearly won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, which is exactly what happened in 2016, which has happened in American history in the past, and it's exactly how the Constitution says presidential elections are supposed to work. And then Biden refused to concede in this scenario, and they got busy looking for ways to make him the president, even though he lost, up to and including conceivably the use of the military, street violence. They called it a street fight. They used the phrase passive protests, peaceful protests. But that phrase has become a joke, like so many other things in 2020. Philadelphia just had 2 nights of peaceful protests. Amazingly, peaceful protests are much bloodier than they used to be. A lot more glass gets broken and things get stolen than the peaceful protests that I'm used to, but we continue to redefine words in 2020. So I thought there, and one other data point, 2 Army officers wrote a letter, former Army officers, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying, you need to get ready to use the 82nd Airborne, an active duty military unit, to force the president out of the White House in January, force him at gunpoint. I thought, you add all this together, what they're talking about is we're not going to accept the outcome of this election if it goes against us. We're going to use all means of power that we can muster. It's not clear what powers they can muster. For instance, just because they're talking about having the military try to get Trump out doesn't mean the military will necessarily follow that order. Military might well not. And General Milley, to his credit, at least in this instance, when he got that open letter from 2 former lieutenant colonels, fairly prominent guys in the Democratic progressive think tank world, he implicitly rebuked them by saying that the military will play, quote, no role, unquote, in the upcoming election. A handful of other officers, although very few in my notion, have also stood up and said, look, the military won't do this, and have urged them not to do it, one of them being H.R. McMaster. And I have said, when asked about this, I was never in the military, but having been around the national security state for a long time, I know lots of people who are currently in the military and lots of formers. If any of them are listening and you get an order like this, or you get that whisper phone call from your former boss, your former 3-star, former 4-star, before you hang up, tell them that they're violating a sacred oath they took to the Constitution and to the institution. The U.S. Army, for instance, predates the revolution, the Declaration of Independence, by a year. It's actually older formally than the United States itself in its own tradition. Tell them to stuff it, that you're not going to do that, and urge all of your colleagues not to go along with it if you get such an order, or even more likely than a direct order, a kind of whisper campaign that the national security state engages in, where they get their secret network and say, you know what we need to do now, fellas. Yeah, tell them to stuff it and don't go along.
Yeah, it creates a frightening vision. Mike Waller, I wanted to ask you about this, particularly the part about the way they leaked these things in advance. Mike, Anton mentioned the Insurrection Act. Even as recently as yesterday, Reuters had a long write-up about the Insurrection Act and what it would mean if the president invoked it. What are they trying to do from an information standpoint as they leak these materials, Mike Waller?
This is what we call pre-propaganda, meaning it is a set of themes, set of information designed over a period of time to acclimate us to accept a certain idea that, if foisted upon us all of a sudden, most of us would reject completely. So now it's been half a year since this has been spoken about in public by the actual perpetrators themselves. They want people to know about it. They don't want to show too much evidence because it can make those of us who talk about it look like we're conspiracy theorists, which they want to brush off this kind of theories. But at the same time, they have to speak to their own cadres. So it goes beyond what Mike Anton has talked about to something even bigger, and that is the covert cadre network here in the country as well. Because as all of what he was describing was happening last spring, you had the fringe extremist political parties, which have almost always run a presidential protest candidate every year. They individually decided not to run anybody against Joe Biden from the left. This goes from the old Communist Party USA, old Soviet asset, still is a Russian asset, especially with the older people involved. But you had its former vice presidential candidate, Angela Davis, go on Putin's RT channel last June 15th to endorse Joe Biden and to say he is nowhere near what we want to be, but he's going to bend to what we want. So we're going to go with him. You had others, the Revolutionary Communist Party. These are fringe elements with very few voters, but lots of organized clandestine cadre that operate under discipline. They're all backing Joe Biden at the same time.
Just if I may, one point on why they did it. I've never studied these kinds of techniques the way you guys have, but logically what I thought was something similar to what Michael just said. They're putting this out there in advance to get you ready for what would otherwise seem like a shocking outcome. If they can get the military to actually pull Trump out of the White House at gunpoint, and that's the first the American public has ever heard of it, they will be shocked and they might resist. They might say this is illegitimate and outrageous and how dare you act this way. But if 6 to 9 months in advance, they can work on a narrative which says, look, this is probably going to happen, but if what you see happening shocks you, remember, it's Trump's fault. We started telling you in June, he's going to be the one who won't leave. It will be his fault. It's not us dragging him out of there illegitimately. It's him refusing to leave when he's supposed to leave. Pay no attention to what you think the vote said. We know what the vote said. We know what voter suppression is and how if we just keep counting, it'll all come out right, right? This is his fault, so don't be shocked by what you see. I think that's the getting people primed to accept that message was the point.
And I think
it's what those lieutenant colonels were saying in their statements from over the summer. They said the enemy of the Constitution is Donald Trump. So the unstated part is it's not the communists and the anarchists who want to overthrow our Constitution. Those are our allies. Instead, they said, and they said this to General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Donald Trump is the domestic enemy of the Constitution that you swore to defend against. It is incumbent on you, it's your obligation to remove Donald Trump forcibly from office.
And I think that message has resonated very well with those cadres you talked about, Mike. I looked at some of the anarchist and revolutionary Marxist groups, and they are openly citing this Transition Integrity Project. And they have openly produced their sort of own scenarios for the election, which mimic the scenarios proposed by the Transition Integrity Project. So these concepts that were being flitted about at a high level filtered down to the individual black bloc anarchists that will cause trouble on the street. And so it was a message, I think, that was received, and it's a disturbing one. And so that leads me to the question of what we've seen a number of articles now about proposed and planned post-election disruption and disorder. Shutdown DC is one of these Antifa-linked organizations that has made the news on the conservative side recently for their disruption plans. But I wanted to ask, starting with Mike Anton, and then we'll go to Mike Waller, what do you think the purpose of those threats of disruption are? Right? What is the goal that the left hopes to accomplish by threatening to take to the streets?
I assume it's blackmail, and it's, nice country you have there. Be ashamed if something happens to it. It also reminds me of a sign, a prominent Antifa BLM sign that I've seen. Either people holding it or they're just spray painting it directly onto buildings and monitors, and it's something along the lines of "Are you tired yet?" or "Tired yet?" In other words, we assume that you hate this. You hate rioting. You hate shutdowns and street closures and bridge closures and smashed windows and all of that. Well, the only way to stop it is to give us what we want, or we'll keep it up. Are you tired yet? Now, my operating assumption is they would prefer to win this election without having to do any of that. And if they were confident in these national polls that Biden's up so much, you know, they wouldn't even be thinking about this. They'd think, you know, this is in the bag. I mean, why bother? So if they can't win it outright, then, you know, stage two is, well, let's see if we can win it by chicanery, cheating, you know, throwing out ballots over here, magically finding boxes over there, which has been done before. And a new tactic, given the mail-in, much more widespread use of mail-in voting than has ever been done before, which is we'll just keep the count open for as long as possible until we get the right outcome, and then shut it down and go to court and get a judge to sign off that the count was, you know, that we closed it at exactly that right moment. You know, just keep going. If Trump has a narrow lead in state X or Y or Z, keep counting until Biden goes comfortably ahead, and then have the elected officials say, oh, we're done, certified, right? And if they can't win it that way, then it goes to the street protests. I think the left is banking on a true fact, which is that they can always out-organize the right when it comes to stuff like this. And they have the entirety of the propaganda apparatus of the United States, meaning basically all media, all social media, all intellectual channels, you name it. You know, I actually was on an NPR interview the other day where a guy said, well, what do you mean we control everything? There's Breitbart. And I laughed in his face. It's like, it's not even 99-1 in terms of the propaganda disadvantage of the Democrats to the right. It's more like 99.9 bar to whatever's left. And they think that with those things, they can put so much pressure on Trump and on his supporters that they'll back down. And then the last stage is, if even that doesn't work, and this is where they're really rolling the dice, because as I said, I, in my cynical and you know, pessimistic as I am in a lot of ways, I'm not entirely convinced they can get the military to actually drag Trump out of the White House at gunpoint. And I don't think they're convinced of it either. So that's like last ditch. If nothing else works well, I guess we'll try that.
Yeah, Mike Waller, comments? What is the purpose of the disruption?
The purpose of the disruption is much greater than the 2020 election. This is being run by a network of people who in the late 60s were called New Left. They wanted to overthrow our Constitution back in 1968. They moved into the George McGovern campaign in 1972. They supported the enemy in Vietnam. They, like Angela Davis, got celebrated the Lenin Peace Prize in the Soviet Union, or were trained in East Germany. And they're back here now in their late 60s to mid 70s as old cadre. This is their last time, probably in their lives, to be able to overthrow the government as they've always wanted to. They openly say they want to do that. They have now generations of younger people from, 75 on down to high school age who do want to overthrow the government now. This is their time to do it. So this is not about Joe Biden. It's not about electing him. It's about overthrowing our Constitution.
And I think you saw, of all people, President Trump seemed to notice this issue when in the first debate, he was trying to get Biden to condemn Antifa. And we had the aside comment, "They will overthrow you, Joe." And he seemed to understand this very well, that ultimately these hardliners, do they want Biden elected? Yes. But they want Biden elected because he will be easier to deal with. I heard, for a matter of fact, Lisa Fithian. For those of you who don't know who Lisa Fithian is, she is a major anarchist organizer and trainer. She played a major role in Ferguson, played a major role in the Seattle World Trade Center organization protests in 2000. She's a big deal in the organized hard left. And she said, you have to work for the enemy you want, right? Which in this case meant Biden, because they think Biden will be easier to deal with. And we've seen some language from the more progressive side as well, saying we can drag Biden to the left on any number of issues. And so I think it's worth people thinking about very seriously. If they look at this as just a matchup between Trump and Biden, it's one thing, but it's another thing entirely if you look at it as a matchup between the right and what is ultimately all of this left power, right? So, you know, what does that portend if, let's say, Biden wins? What is the next move for the sort of hard left radical types? Anton.
They'll do what you said, which is try to push him to the left. And in personnel, first of all, they'll try to get veto. They'll make demands. You must hire this person, and this person, and veto various others. But look, they have a problem. I'm not saying it's an overcomable problem. That is to say, it's not an overcomable problem. And I'm not saying that we don't have problems too. But they have a problem in that their coalition is very inherently unstable. I mean, Wall Street and accumulated capital and corporate power centers is not exactly a perfect fit with the anarchist, Visigoth, city-sacking, psychopathic, vampiric, parasitic, blood-drinking left. This is not a marriage made in heaven, right? The people who have the capital and who live in the fortress buildings on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue mostly don't want to see them burned down with all their Rembrandts torched along with it and themselves inside, right? And yet that's what the power structure in these cities is doing and enabling right now. I'm exaggerating a little, but I don't think very much, right? And so the corporatists who hate, why do they hate Trump? Well, because he wants to restrict trade deals, be more protectionist, meaning which reduces globalization. It reduces the ability to move capital around and make profits in other markets and things like that. It hikes up wages here at home. He wants to restrict immigration, same issue. He wants to do all of these things that limit their power and wealth, but he also doesn't want to just come after them and kill them and destroy them. And yet they've reacted in a really psychotic frenzy against Trump that I find a pretty massive overreaction. So either they've miscalculated badly and they don't realize how out of control this foot soldier army they have is, or they think they can control it, and then will be the ultimate. The Biden administration will be the ultimate test of whether coastal financial oligarchic elites, tech elites, finance elites, corporatist elites, the university, all the places where there's concentrated wealth and power in this country, whether they can keep the reins tight on their orc army or whether they can't. And I actually don't know the answer to that. This is going to be one of those things like fighting a nuclear war where all the game theory in the world avails you nothing. You're only going to really figure out how it works by doing it. And I'd rather not run the experiment, but we may, at any rate, do it, and then we'll find out how it works.
I think Anton raises a really good point when he talks about this relationship between sort of elements of corporate power and the hard left, because we've seen this in real life with these massive contributions to Black Lives Matter organizations, which are the organizations that are engaged, in organizing these protests, in bailing these rioters and insurrectionists out of jail. And yet they're receiving major donations from large funds and large donors, and major corporations. Mike Waller, how does that happen? Why, in your view, are they seem to be so all in on what is ultimately an ideological movement that abhors them?
Part of it is what we call lamb's blood, like the Jews during the Passover, painting the lintels of their doors with lamb's blood so that the spirit of death would pass over them. So they really think they're getting away from it. That's why the Teamsters Union building right on Capitol Hill had BLM signs all over the place, but they got beat up anyway. So sometimes the lamb's blood works and sometimes it doesn't. I thought a more dangerous level, though, is CEOs themselves, who are now extremist billionaires, and whose staff and the personnel in these companies, where they rebel against Google or Amazon or other places getting Pentagon contracts. And now you have internal rebellions within the companies, which have hired really left-wing engineers and social media people and others to staff these businesses. So the businesses depend on having a happy workforce. And if the workforce wants to be happy, then the bosses have to be funding the movement that will ultimately destroy them.
Yeah, I mean, you have this really weird situation where corporate leaders seem to be responding to the sort of more radical elements of their HR departments than their customers, the people who actually pay them, or the people who utilize their services. And I think we see this particularly in the IT sector and the social media sector, right? Where Twitter and Facebook and some of these other IT guys are really out there in terms of their ideologies, and they're willing to use their platforms, which are ostensibly supposed to be about making money, in a political way. I mean, if we look at this most recent situation with the New York Post being banned from Twitter, right? You have what is essentially an implication for affecting the election. So I am curious, and I think that lends to the question of what do we think the social media tycoons will do in the immediate aftermath of the election?
Well, I would say there's actually, it's the two places where that the 20-somethings rule is most common is social media, as you said, but also legacy media. And the difference between, in my just sort of anecdotal or my general sense of it, is the difference between a legacy media manager and the social media management is, first of all, a decade or two. Usually the legacy media people, they're more likely to be in their 50s and 60s. They're more likely to also be old school liberals, not necessarily as down with the wokeness as, say, a Mark Zuckerberg is. But both do have in common that they're terrified of their young employees. They won't stand up to them. And they back down to them swiftly because I assume that they, in their own minds, fear that revolt will do more, reputational or brand damage, but also to them personally. We've seen people get fired, people with, 30-year careers at the same institution, just for approving, not even writing, just for approving a particular story. And the 20-somethings rebel and management caves, and, people resign or resign, whatever. So your question was, what will social media do? I mean, this is a question, a very important question, which is how cynical are they versus how religious are they? By meaning, I believe that Mark Zuckerberg is both cynical and religious. He's cynical. He likes being a billionaire. He wants to control as much of the and you could say this about a lot of these guys, including Dorsey and the guys who run Google and a lot of other sites. But just take Zuckerberg as a proxy. So he wants to be a billionaire and stay a billionaire and make even more billions. He wants to control as much information flow as he can, have as much power as he can. But he also wants to believe in a religion that if he acted on every tenet of its faith of all kinds, let's just say his hiring practices would be a lot different. He'd be hiring on completely different criteria than who's the best coder or who's the fastest coder or who's the this or that. And those goals will be in tension with his bottom line over time. Which way will he go? I expect in the beginning, he, like most of them, if not all of them, are convinced there's no tension between the tenets of my faith and the demands or the imperatives of my business, so I can keep doing exactly what I'm doing, get even richer and more powerful. If I'm right that there is in fact a tension over time, that if you're not hiring the best person for the job in most cases, if you're not looking strictly at quality, especially for technically demanding jobs, if you're not making qualifications for tasks that, let's face it, if anybody knows anything about coding, and I know a tiny bit, it's pretty repetitive and boring, right? It takes a certain kind of, let's say, dorky cast of mind to do that. If you're not seeking that out as a thing in and of itself, but you're saying, like, I'm making my business a social cause, I'm going to hire on that basis, then eventually I would think it's got to have to stress the efficacy of the business model, the bottom line, and so on. And only then will he be forced with a choice. And I don't know when that moment comes, but it's not going to come next year. Next year, he'll be all in on both sides of the ledger, is my expectation.
Mike, social media control in the immediate aftermath of the election. Let's say we have this contested situation. What is the social media going to do? Are they going to censor the president's Twitter feed? Or prevent us from sort of getting information about what sort of disruptions or bad behavior we might be seeing in the streets? What do you expect?
Well, if the president is any indication of what to expect in a week or two, then yeah, they're going to be censoring a lot of content. What I would expect is, now that Antifa and these other groups are censoring their own violence to protect the identities of the violent extremists themselves, by banning people with cameras, by smashing people's phones and so forth, I would suspect that the social media companies will then take any so-called unauthorized videos as violent content or some other form of objectionable content that will also be banned.
Right. So you have no way of getting. We will have limited access to seeing what's actually happening in some of these quote unquote peaceful protests. And we've already seen that to a certain extent. Most of you probably know that there were major riots in Portland and Minneapolis and some of these other places, but then the major media stopped covering it. And if you're a big social media news consumer, you've still seen it because various live streamers are still going out and putting videos out of Antifa and some of these other groups engaging in their activities. But they're now being targeted for doing that. Videos are being shut down, as Mike Waller said. So it could be the case that there's major disruption going on, and yet we don't have the site in to see it. Or if you're not a certain type of consumer, you won't see it.
That'd be an interesting test of how powerful these platforms really are. I don't know the answer to this either, but is it really possible? I suppose it's conceivable, but is it really possible over the long term to have, say, let's say Trump wins, the leftist coup fails, or they either don't attempt it. There are some signs that they're backing off, or at least getting a little bit circumspect about talking about it too publicly. Let's say either they try it and it fails, or they don't try it and Trump is in there, and massive street demonstrations in 200 cities lead to violence, chaos, and looting and just property damage in 50 cities or something like that. Twitter and Facebook and Google and all these can do everything as much as they can try to do to suppress that. Is it going to be possible for them to long term to just memory hold so that America doesn't know that there was this much chaos and violence in the cities? Or will people at least call their relatives, wow, it's really bad over here, what's it like over there? And word will get around. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an open question, because we've already seen in this past year, and definitely in the past 4 years of the Trump administration, a real bifurcation based on where people get their media. Where if you're watching Fox News and you're consuming other conservative outlets online, you're seeing one set of behavior, and if you're a major consumer of mainstream media, you're seeing a totally different set of behavior. And I think that creates an additional risk with sort of disruptive situations like we're facing post-election, because if you have a situation where what conservatives are seeing is disorder and violence in the streets and riots, and then certain behaviors like calling out the police, calling out the National Guard will seem very rational. But yet if you're a consumer who is not being presented with that material, and you hear, oh, the president ordered troops into the streets, you'll say, oh, here comes the Trumpist coup, right? So this bifurcation of where we get our media and how we understand what is actually happening in the world creates this separation and this tension that I think is going to be really concerning. And then, of course, you do have space there for foreign disinformation operations to cause trouble and those kinds of things as well. So I want to spend a little bit of time on this last question, because I think it's worth going into in some detail. Let us say Trump appears to be the winner on election day. We do have disruption. We do have riots. The situation looks like it did in that period of the George Floyd riots, or worse. What does he do on that period between election night to Inauguration Day, and then after Inauguration Day?
What does Trump do?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, just because he appears to win on election night doesn't mean he won, or that it will be accepted that he won. So I think what he would need to do is have lawyers in the ground in every close state be ready to litigate either any variety of outcomes. I think in states that he appears to have won, the Democrats will say, no, we need to keep counting. There's new ballots coming in. Oh, look, here comes a truck with ballots from a nursing home over on 5th and Main. We need to count these, or you're suppressing them, and so on. This is going to have to be on the lookout for that kind of thing and stop it, while, of course, being careful to make sure that legitimate votes do get counted, both because it's the right thing to do and because he doesn't want to open himself to genuine charges of voter suppression. He'll be charged with voter suppression no matter what he does, even if he tries to exclude ballots that are clearly fraudulent. He's got to be, extremely careful about that. Then phase two would be if at a certain point the vote is either legitimately tallied and he won, and or it just, a la Florida in 2000, courts, whether the Supreme Court or lower courts, step in and just say, it's over. We need a president. It's over. And we're declaring him the winner. I guess what happens from there depends on what they're doing. It very much depends on what they're doing. I would think that a president fairly confident that he had been elected to a second term. If cities are burning and being destroyed, I mean, if there's really physical harm taking place, I tend to think he would be a lot less lenient about it than in the post-election environment than he was this year. When we know his instinct, I think he was pretty clear. His instinct was to go in there and get a lot of this under control. But that's hard to do when you're opposed by local mayors, Democratic governors, and things like that. I don't know. That same tactic, or sorry, that same issue could prevail. That is to say, okay, X city is on fire, you can't get it under control, I'm coming in. You could have the Democratic mayor and governor go, no, you stay out of here. You're bad, you'll make the problem worse. It puts the president in a horrible spot because he's taken an oath to protect and defend the laws, protect citizens' lives, and things like that, on the one hand. On the other hand, without the cooperation of the locals, indeed with the active opposition of the locals, it can be hard to know what effectively to do. And it's possible that even the best intentioned action could make things worse through no fault of your own if you're opposed by the people, the officials on the ground.
Right. The so-called anarchic jurisdictions, which they did take an effort to sort of deal with by targeting federal funds to these cities and so on. Mike Waller, Trump appears to have won on election night or shortly thereafter. What should he be doing to prevent post-election disruption and, up from election night through inauguration day?
His first duty as president is to protect the presidency as an institution. And when you have organized violent groups saying that they are going to lay siege to the White House and burn it down, the president has to treat that very seriously. Now, in the previous confrontation several months ago with the White House, it's clear the authorities weren't prepared, and they just put up regular old riot fences and a few K9 units, and that's pretty much it. But the mayor of Washington, D.C. instructed the police to cooperate as little as possible. She has since instructed, this is Mayor Muriel Bowser, has instructed the D.C. police not to answer calls for distress from the home of Senator McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, and other lawmakers here. I got this from the Capitol Police themselves. They physically told me this when I went to talk to them about how these things work. So you have the mayor of Washington, D.C. as part of this. What has she done? Look at the color revolutions around the world in Eastern Europe and Iran and North Africa, and they all needed a large area on which to converge crowds. Now, I was, by full disclosure, involved in a couple of those in Eastern Europe and in Iran. Not in North Africa because that was a Muslim Brotherhood operation. But looking at these other things, I know how these things are run, and I've been involved with them at the street level myself years before. They need a staging area that's right close to the seat of power, in which these countries would be the presidential palace or whatever. Here it would be the White House. What Mayor Bowser has done now for half a year is she has cut off a prime commuter avenue, 16th Street North in Washington, D.C., with high-end hotels and with the headquarters of the AFL-CIO and other big unions, from a block north of the White House on the other side of Lafayette Park, so 500 feet north of the White House, extending the length of 3 football fields. It remains a closed-off staging area, armored with concrete barriers, and the union buildings are there, which have been sympathetic. They have their own lamb's blood hanging out of their windows and so forth. But there's been a lot of extra construction work and big trucks going in the AFL-CIO headquarters. Who knows what's happening? But what we do know from, let's say, the Maidan in Ukraine, they did not have a staging area to overthrow the regime leader there, and it ended up taking them a long time. They said if they did have a staging area like Black Lives Matter Plaza, just north of the White House, they could have done it a lot sooner. So we have to be prepared for these mobs to converge by the tens of thousands, if not more, right in downtown Washington, D.C., and storm the White House. What they'll do is they'll get kids and other well-meaning people who don't have experience and aren't that cynical and aren't that afraid. They'll get them to be the ones to take the batons and the dog bites and the bullets. But what we do not see right now is we don't have the president, we don't have any signs that the president is going to federalize the Washington, D.C. police. He needs to do that. The police union in D.C. polled 97% of its members don't trust, don't respect, and don't like the city leaders. I don't think the D.C. police would mind at all being federalized. If the mayor of D.C. has instructed, do not protect senior leadership of this country, when it's the job of the police to do that, President Trump should federalize them and should extend a perimeter that goes well beyond the staging area to deprive that area of these violent protesters that we're expecting.
Can I just say, that's the first time I've heard that, and that's a big story, it seems to me. If that's true and could be verified, either on the record or with multiple background sources saying this order was given and it's a partisan order, it applies either only to Republicans or only to certain named people such as Mitch McConnell, given propaganda control of the media, it won't break through maybe to mass public consciousness, but it would certainly get the attention of our side and help inform our side what the stakes are. Because to me, the worst thing about 2020, and boy, is there a long list to choose from. The worst thing about 2020 is the complete inversion of the use of state power. We have seen state power either egg on and encourage rioting, looting, and violence and chaos, or refuse to do anything about it, or find itself feckless, weak, and incapable of doing anything about it, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, when lawful citizens, decent citizens, innocent citizens, peaceful citizens take action to defend themselves against violence that the state won't or can't stop, suddenly the state finds its moxie and leaps into action to persecute people for defending themselves. To add to that, an order from the DC mayor not to protect senior leaders of another party is an extraordinarily malevolent act, and shows you how frankly evil and 180 degrees opposite of what it is supposed to do the government has become, and how they're really pushing this country in a revolutionary direction. But my main point is I've never heard that before. It's extraordinary, even in an extraordinary year. If that's true and can be substantiated, that needs to be written up and disseminated as widely as possible. This is what we're dealing with now. We're dealing at a state that hates us and looks at us as enemies and wants to harm us. And people need to know that, if that's the case.
Yeah, it's pretty scary stuff. I will point out, just on the topic of staging areas, Mike, that Black Lives Matter has already been used as a training and staging area for shutdown DC, and their current plan is indeed to have people gather there on election night in order to be prepared to respond for whichever of their perceived scenarios take place. So I think your point on that staging area question is a really big one, and let us hope that to the extent their officials above them will allow them, law enforcement in DC is taking appropriate action to deal with that. So with that said, let's bring Adam Savitt back in, and we'll take some questions from the chat room. We've got a really great attendance today, so I'm sure we're going to have a number of questions. So Adam, go ahead and take it away. Adam, we're not getting audio from you.
Apologies for that.
There you are.
Yep. We have plenty of questions. If, God willing, we get through this and Trump is reelected and inaugurated, what can the administration do in 4 years to solve this? Is there any feasible way to clean out the military and intelligence community without destroying them?
Well, the quick answer to that is probably, and certainly in the case of the IC, probably no. But it also can't be done in 4 years. I think you could make a lot of progress in 4 years and set parameters. It would help. Probably long-term reform of the IC in particular would need to be, you need the full cooperation of the legislature, which means we're going to need both houses of Congress back in. But also another reason why this is a long-term project is Republican politicians, Republican voters, Republican intellectuals, to the extent that that's not an oxymoron, are still way too confident in the so-called deep state, or the these guys are patriots, they selflessly protect us. We're the law and order, we're the hawks, we're the ones who live without illusions. Therefore, yes, we're against the soft side of the administrative state, the welfare dole, You know, the people who hand out the checks and all of that, okay, yeah, they're the bad government employees. And the people who regulate you and fine you for killing a fly on your property and that kind of thing and confiscating your property, right? But no, these ones over here that are doing national security stuff, they're all the good guys. They're on our side. And Republicans will be, legislators will be very skeptical of any kind of real reform with teeth because of that presupposition that they have, which is a false presupposition. So an educational project, which I mean has been going on for the last 4 years. The Russia scandal has been nothing if not revelatory to a lot of Republicans that these agencies are not as friendly as they thought they were. But we're not at a point in you know, Republican legislative public opinion where they're ready to clean it up in 4 years. That's going to be a much longer term project.
Yeah, I'll also add that there are a number of services and departments, some of which have been positive actors and some of which have been negative actors. We've seen very good activity, for example, coming out of the U.S. Marshals Service, coming out of Homeland Security investigations, and the generally DHS was pretty exemplar in dealing with the Portland situation. So there are some places where we've gotten pretty decent activity, and it may be up to the president and his team to figure out how best to use those services and departments which are most responsive, and to sideline those which are least responsive or are behaving negatively.
Government unions.
Yeah, and then there are other deep reforms that, a lot of deep reforms you need. There's not a single major university in the United States that educates people to go into intelligence and counterintelligence and federal investigations that is not a liberal left university. There are very few that are even middle of the road anymore. And so they're providing the intellectual cadre to go in. Even people with good motivations, they've just been conditioned to view the world in a certain way. They go into the system, and there are really very few, let's say, Hillsdale type places, which doesn't even offer a lot of that national security curriculum and doesn't have a grad program. There are few.
Few grad programs now.
It does. As a matter of fact, Anton teaches there.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty new offer.
Some students to send your way. Okay. But
we see what you're talking about. These feeder schools into the national security system in the DC area, the Georgetown Foreign Service, SICE, and so on and so forth. Those are the ones where the bulk of the MAs, you know, they're basically professional degrees, or you know, they see themselves like a law school or a business school. Their purpose is to train you to then go into the system. And yes, they're not training you to go into the system and bucket or see things the way we see things. That's for sure.
Right. And plus they get a lot of funding from places like Qatar and communist China that they're not fully accountable for yet either, but that's probably good for another webinar after the election.
To combine a few questions, there's questions about the role of foreign powers and Cuba, Venezuela, and China being named.
I'll let you go. I don't actually know. I'm aware of a few things that, you know, there were some foreign activity supporting protests here and there, at least allegations of that seemed credible to me, but it didn't seem like it amounted to much. But then again, I also didn't dive deeply into it and try to figure it out.
Mike,
coming out of that, Kyle, in a monograph that's coming out. This goes back half a century, where you have fully recruited foreign assets who've been working for the Cubans or the Russians or others into the late 60s, early 70s, conscious recruited agents, meaning under their control, who are key intellectual leaders of the BLM movement. Again, going back to Angela Davis, she's the one who pioneered the idea of defunding prisons and defunding police and all of that. And now it's mainstream, all the way to the Venceremos brigades. When you think that a sort of a mainstream liberal Democrat like Joe Biden would have on his lists of semifinalists for his running mate, Congresswoman Karen Bass, who's a full hardcore Cuban regime collaborator through the Venceremos brigades. She knows exactly what she's doing. She was trained in Cuba to do this. And she's picked, almost picked, as a Manchurian candidate behind this doddering Joe Biden to be the next president of the United States. So you have The Angela Davis cadre was trained in East Germany and the Soviet Union and Cuba. Karen Bass was trained in Cuba. Also, you have now Trevor Loudon's been doing some great work on exposing communist Chinese funding and organizational activities behind the Asians for Black Lives Matter element, among other things. So there is considerable foreign support behind these movements at the organizer level.
Yeah, and we also saw in terms of election disinformation, and the DHS and the IC came out and did call this one out, that the Iranians using voter registrations to send threatening letters to Democrats in Florida, proclaiming to be from the Proud Boys, of course, playing into a whole media narrative of our own. So I think we need to be aware, as conservatives, because of the situation with the whole Russian collusion narrative over the past 4 years, we've been very reluctant to talk about foreign interference because, the left has made that all about Russia and Donald Trump, which is a nonsense narrative. But the reality is that there are genuine foreign actors, and they are in play in things like Antifa and like Black Lives Matter. They do play in that area. Anytime you have civil unrest or strife between parties in a nation, you're going to have foreign actors interfering. So we should keep that in mind.
Right, and even in the Transition Integrity Project program that Mike Anton was describing, they even brought up a theme during that exercise that's a Russian-sponsored theme called Kalexit, which is California seceding from the United States, along with the Pacific Northwest. So they're actually repeating themes that are being sponsored from Russia, and mainstreaming it in the whole strategy.
That's where I'll take the side of my foreign adversary. They think they're hurting us by doing that. They just don't understand the country very well. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to believe that most of Red America, not that I'm in Red America, I only wish I were, but that most of Red America or the rest of the country would get down on its knees, and I say this as a native Californian, and say, please stay if California threatens secession. I think the resulting, leaving us, aside from the electoral dominance of the Republican Party that would give us for a couple of generations, there's so many incalculable benefits of letting the fruits and nuts on the left coast just go and have their own utopia without us interfering with them, which I have no desire to do, but also without them interfering with us, which they have a great many desires to do.
Right, but you're not echoing a Russian active measures campaign. You're positing an intellectual argument. But yeah, the Biden camp is pushing a Russian active measures campaign, which Putin's RT channel is amplifying.
Yeah, and by the way, check out Anton's book, The Stakes, if you want to see some more about these issues with the tensions pulling at the country's seams, because it's worth the read. Adam?
Well, Kyle, you mentioned the Proud Boys. This viewer asked, the leftist media, including NPR, is pushing the opposite scenario that we're talking about here. It's claiming that right-wing militias will take to the streets. Also, the fact they emphasize that these right-wing groups will be armed and dangerous, starting on election day at polls and going forward when Biden wins. Can you comment on that?
I have not seen a right-wing militia. I mean, what right-wing militia? What are you talking about? 5 guys with a gun at a barbecue? Something with gun? I mean, has the right in American history ever staged a street protest 1/10 the size? I guess maybe the Virginia gun rally earlier this year. I might add the entirely peaceful protest in defense of a constitutional right gun rally. But that's a once in a generation happening. This is a fantasy projection, in my opinion.
Yeah, David Reboy and I wrote an article about what we call the Antifa Industry, where we talked about just the level of organization that goes into being able to put people in the streets to conduct this behavior, both the peaceful demonstrations as well as the violent ones and the violent riots. There's a tremendous amount of organization that goes into it, a tremendous amount of money that's required to go into it for the training and the creation of cadres and these sorts of things. The right has none of that. The right has never had any kind of organized street politicking capability. They just never have. This notion that somehow Donald Trump can make a call and conservatives will be in the street. It just doesn't exist. It's a non-thing.
What role do you see organizations like the Lincoln Project playing in shaping the anti-Trump narrative pre and post-election?
Close to zero. I think that's a lot of great example of big donors getting hoodwinked by slick types who know how to spend money that does not. It's going to make a handful of consultants and ad buyers and such rich, but I don't think it's had any impact at all on the general election. I don't think the left. They're people without a home or a country. They despise their former friends in their own party, who despise them heartily right back in return. And they're useful idiots for now, but I think if they think that they're going to have a permanent home and be welcomed with open arms on the left and actually have influence, I think they're going to find that also is a fantasy, and they'll find it out pretty quick.
Yeah, I've got a little different take on the Lincoln Project, because this is another example of foreign agents working to defeat Donald Trump and elect Joe Biden. The co-founder of the Lincoln Project, John Weaver, is a former George W. Bush / John Kerry / would-be Donald Trump / Joe Biden political operative who just sort of, we have words for those kinds of people. Weaver was a registered agent for Vladimir Putin's government last year. Yeah, we published the documents on that he signed with the Justice Department, saying that he was a paid agent for a registered agent for the atomic energy entity in Russia that manufactures Putin's modernized nuclear warhead program that's aimed at us. This guy is the co-founder of the Lincoln Project.
And then you have
that $40 million campaign out of a P.O. box on Capitol Hill. So you really have to ask questions. What kind of foreign intervention is there on the Joe Biden side? When they talk about Kremlin narrative and Kremlin disinformation and Russian collusion, look no further than the Lincoln Project.
And then you have that example of the Lincoln Project echoing that Iranian disinformation campaign about the Proud Boys, just really sort of cluelessly jumping on any piece of bad information that they could accelerate about the Trump campaign.
Or was it clueless?
So unfortunately, and with that one, just to remind everyone, the whole series is available, securefreedom.org, on our webinar tab. We have archived the whole thing, so take a look. And with that, I'll throw it back to Kyle. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank our panelists for joining me today. I really enjoyed this. I hope you guys did too. Michael, Anton, the book is The Stakes, America at the Point of No Return. Please do go check it out. It's worth seeing. It's a little scary, but it's something I think you need to read. Mike Waller, thanks for joining us. Read Mike's work on the role played by bad actors like Angela Davis in the Antifa movement in our new monograph, Unmasking Antifa, 5 Perspectives on a Growing Threat. I'm the editor of that monograph. We've got a number of great contributors. I think it's going to be well worth your time. This is our last voter education series webinar for the season. So we will let you know in the near future what our next webinar program will be. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us. Michael Anton, Mike Waller, thank you very much.
Thank you.